Chapter 14. Prudence tumbled helplessly at first, head over heels, the water rushing toward her. From that height, if she belly flopped, with some effort she got her feet pointed down. Saw the dragon heading toward her, and Octavius grab it. Had time for a smile as it got yanked into the water, and then she plunged in after it. It knocked the breath out of her. Felt like she went down and down forever. So far she'd never be able to get back to the surface in time. Did she see Octavius struggle with the dragon? She wasn't sure. It was so strange under the water, like a dream, and yet, her arms felt heavy and her clothes added to the drag. She managed to raise her arms, though it felt like slow motion. She cut through the water with a weak breaststroke, hoping to stop the descent. Gradually, but far too slowly, she began to rise. Her lungs ached for air, felt as if they'd explode if she didn't inhale. Strong arms wrapped around her, no, not arms, tentacles. Octavius. In his hold she surged up, barely conscious. They burst clear of the water just as Prudence had to inhale or explode. She sucked in the warm, salt-tanged air with gratitude and more than a little surprise. She leaned her head against his dome. "Thank you, sweet baby. I'm so sorry I got you into this." A tentacle patted her head, while another held her securely. He started them toward the shore. A figure stood there. Not the one she'd expected. Octavius lifted her onto a block of granite and drifted back. Her chest still heaved. Water ran down her face, obscuring her vision. Water ran out of clothes that felt like weights wrapping her arms and legs. She peered through the slowly thinning stream of water and managed to scramble into a sitting position. He was still there. She honestly didn't trust her eyes, her senses, anything after what had happened. He worked his way across the blocks with surprising nimbleness until he reached her, helped her to a more secure spot at the base of the lighthouse. The morning sky was deeply blue but streaked with glorious streaks of purple and blue. As near as she could tell from below, the lighthouse was undamaged. She leaned way back. Even the railing was back to normal, it seemed. "Why did you jump?" he asked. She looked at him, this man who looked like her grandfather, a much better version than the chained specter, by the way. She opened her mouth. Closed it. Finally managed, "I didn't jump. I fell." He looked up, his expression dubious. "Did you?" He looked around, like an absent-minded professor, looking for his glasses. "Well, I'm not quite sure. I dare say we should. This appears to be an island, but I'm sure there's someone." He stopped, frowning down at her. "Do I know you? Have we met?" She looked like his wife, or so she'd been told. What she didn't know was how her grandfather could have survived that, whatever it was. If time or something else had done a reset, why did she remember? She looked up where the ghost ship had been and held back a shudder of remembered horror. Would have been very happy to forget that, but not if it meant forgetting Ernest. Before she could speak, he rubbed his face. "I apologize. That was quite rude. I'm Pauline Pinkerton the fourth." Her dad was the fifth. Did he remember her dad? "I'm pleased to meet you, sir. I'm Prudence Pinkerton." A frown formed slowly between his brows. "Prudence, I don't Prudence?" "Yes, sir." He studied her curiously. "You have the look of my wife. I thought you might be, but you are too young." "My father is Franklin the Fifth." He frowned. "Why don't I remember you?" "We've never actually met," she said, because that was easier than the long answer that he might not remember. If he was back properly, did that mean they'd done it? She looked around, then up. "Where was Ernest?" "I'm sorry, sir, but there was someone in the lighthouse. I need to check on him, them. I'll be back, just sit here, okay?" He nodded, seemed almost happy for the time to reflect. She ran up the steps and inside, but when she looked up the winding stairs, she found she couldn't rush. Dread added weight to her climb. Or maybe gravity was in a bad mood. Around and around and around some more. What would she find up there? If proper time had been restored, maybe Ernest wasn't here. Maybe he was back in Galveston with Ophelia. She saw a window and looked out. Her knees sagged a bit. The weatherman. It was still there at the end of the rustic pier. She could see some automations moving around the deck. She reached the watchroom. No sign of Ernest's instruments or the crates of his notes. Were they back on the ship or lost? She heard movement up above her. Was it Ernest up there? And if it was, what would she find in his eyes this time? Ernest rubbed his head. It ached so strangely. He explored the source where most of the pain radiated from, and found a lump. What on earth? He felt as if he'd wakened too soon from a dream or a nightmare, but one he hadn't wanted to leave. One he needed to recall. He touched the back of his head now, though carefully. He remembered arriving here, though that seemed strange and murky in some half-remembered way. The lightkeeper had let him stay, but why had he come up here? The morning was clear and warm. He inhaled the humid, salty air. He felt lighter. As if he'd left a burden behind. Was this what they'd meant when they had said he would get over his loss? He could think of Ophelia without pain. And yet there was still pain and a feeling of loss. But what else could he have lost? He heard footsteps on the stairs. Not an automaton, so it must be the lightkeeper. A woman's footsteps. But how did he know that? He turned from the railing and climbed back inside the lamp room, a strange sensation of hope stirring inside him. First, the top of a head came into view. Bedraggled wet hair, then a pale worried face. Brown eyes, anxiety in them. An uncertain smile flickering on lips. Those lips. Surely. I know her, he thought, but how could he? And yet he did. His heart leapt with joy even as his brain struggled to understand. Prue, for a moment he stalled, then Prudence? A real smile flowed across her face, though some uncertainty remained in her eyes. Worry as well. She was drenched, trailing water still. Some trickled down the side of her face, and she dashed at it impatiently. What do you remember? A frown creased his forehead. You fell. He jerked around, pieces floating inside his head. Disconnected. Strange. Impossible. 6 impossible things. Impossible things? Her hands closed around his. That felt right, so right. He clung because it helped the floating pieces spin slower. Some of them drifted close, as if they wanted to fit together. I'm afraid there were a few more than 6 of them, she said, apologetically. Sorry about that. He freed a hand to push back a damp strand of her hair. I don't remember you, but I do. He hesitated, but felt it had to be said before it was too late. How can I love you and not remember who you are? His grip tightened on hers. She could vanish. He must keep her here. He frowned. Do you have a giant octopus? She laughed then, the sound as bright and hopeful as the morning. I do. She sobered. And I love you too. He stared at her, absurdly happy, though he should not be. Why? I hope, she said, moving closer so that he had to put his arms around her, that this will help. It did before. Her chin lifted as she presented her mouth. Before. He might not remember everything, but he did remember how to kiss a woman. No, how to kiss this woman. And he was very eager to do it again. You've been listening to Specters in the Storm by Pauline Baird Jones. Copyright by Pauline Baird Jones. All rights reserved.